Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So it's quite admirable, all of you here for the weekend, listening to Dhamma for a long time, which is right in line with the tradition that Lumpur Cha established at his own monastery, as we've been hearing from the stories. And we've had a chance, no doubt, to be inspired as well as to be bored, perhaps, or at least restless, because even during the most inspiring times, because things change and because the body is as it is and our minds move as they do, we'll always move away from that which we're attracted to after a time. We'll see that that which is inspiring, if you get too much, is not as attractive anymore. So we'll try to wrap it up for everyone. I won't be speaking for 3 hours. There will be one more after me. But I'm sure he'll have a lot to say that will be worthwhile. That's the thing. There's a lot of things to say, and also really nothing to say. It's one of the paradoxes we face with Dhamma practice. The way that it's traditionally communicated like this in words is not really the way that we learn. The words themselves are pointers and guides that help to turn us or direct us to what we can learn for ourselves without words, directly. And these are some of the stories that have inspired me during these few days, listening to those who had the good fortune to actually live with Lumpur Cha when he was alive and actively teaching. That indeed, what all of us, I think, who've come to the monastic life and to the Buddhist way of life and come into contact with communities of practitioners who are earnest and have integrity, find is that the way we learn often is not verbal. It's through being with others who are being in a different way. So we have these teachings, verbal teachings we can read. We have gestures and rituals, so we'll end the evening again with chanting that's been done for hundreds and in some cases thousands of years. We have ways of relating to each other that we've inherited from the tradition and provide a beautiful container and context for us to develop relationships based on Dhamma and the aspiration to learn in this particular kind of way, rather than those of the world, other sets of conventions we could choose. And that's all well and good. But they are, in the end, all still conventions, of course. It's really not about being a good Buddhist in all of the external ways that we can be, although that is a wonderful and beautiful and important support. It's about finding what the Dhamma is for ourselves in our experience. And for me, as one of the monks who came in later on in the late 80s, when Lumpur Cha was already very ill, and I didn't come to Thailand, I came to England, so I only heard about Lumpur Cha until we heard one January day in 1992 that he had passed away. I had basically to take the teachings that he'd given, the inheritance that we've all received from his disciples from the communities that he'd established, either directly or indirectly. And I think that's the case for most of us here. We've come into contact with the disciples of Luang Por Chah, the disciples of Luang Por Chah, and seen that there is something worthwhile. And of course, for Luang Por Chah himself, this was also the case. He came into contact with Luang Por Mun and disciples of disciples of disciples of the Buddha, if we trace it right back. So the Buddha wasn't really interested, from what I understand, in necessarily creating a big religion, an institution called Buddhism, and having everybody become Buddhist and saying, we believe. He was interested in sharing the tools with which we can each discover the truth for ourselves. And in order to do that in a way where it wouldn't get lost over time, because of the way that we are as human beings, then some kind of institution, some kind of conventional structure was necessary to preserve a formal way of communicating this intuitive, experiential possibility, the possibility for freedom of the heart, freedom from suffering. And so we always face this tension, this paradox of having all these, say for the monks, all these rules and guidelines, things to hold on to and to hold to, as well as for those of you who are interested as lay people, the precepts you adopt, the ways of relating that we have, the way of life that is defined for us, which is supportive of realization. We have those conventions to hold to, and yet it is a paradox because they're intended to lead us to be able to let go of conventions, to see through them, to not be identified with being a Buddhist or being anything else, even with being enlightened. If we're identified with being enlightened, well then we're fooling ourselves, because that's the essence of what we're asked to learn, where it is that we create ourselves, where it is that we create the world. And for that, Luang Por Chah was, for me, just one of several, and yet by far the most important figure that I'd come into contact indirectly through the preserved teachings, talks, books that have been produced, translations, and of course, the way of life that I've entered into as a monk in his communities. The most important figure to really point to that essential learning, that essential lesson, that the world, ourself, suffering, the end of suffering, isn't to be found outside, but it is to be found right here. It's right where we already are. As Ajahn Chah was eloquently putting it, in terms of the teaching, really what we're working with is always the present moment. And this is something that my teacher, Luang Por Sumedho, really emphasizes in a way which is direct and effective. And one really feels that the disciples of Luang Por Chah, like Luang Por Liam, and those of us who knew the monks who've been here with us this weekend, teachers and guides themselves, to the extent that we are able to internalize and ground and actually embody the teachings, that essential point needs to be understood in some way. That it's not about our ideas of who we are or our expectations of how it's going to be. It's not about trying to change the way that things are. It's about this moment and how we are able to relate to it, or let go of our habitual ways of relating, as the case may be. So we learn, we have these chances, and holding yourselves in a seat and listening like this is, it's probably, we have these 10-minute breaks where you go out and have some tea and juice and whatever it is that you're being offered on the lay side of the curtains. So it's not quite as intense and difficult as, say, I'm looking at Luang Por Theravada sitting down there. I can imagine I can only imagine how it was on the cement in the cold after the 5th hour of Lumpur Cha speaking in Lao, nighttime, telling the same story a number of times, just to drive home the point that what he's really teaching is auton, really learn about where is the suffering. And this is what was so important to me in coming into the community. I can only speak to my own experience. When I got to England, it was evident that the foundations of the teaching one could find in different places. How to meditate, places to meditate, quiet, supportive, say, retreat centers and monasteries. One could find this. But what was really difficult to find was a community, a way of living with each other that was both had enough integrity to hold you to the point and really help you learn the point, that is letting go and of what it is that makes us suffer, as well as train us, poke us. I could see that when I got to the monastery, it was England, it was November, it was 1989, and there wasn't enough money to heat the place at Amaravati, so we had a heater between two people. You had to decide who was going to be warm when, and there was a wood stove to cook for about 50-odd people, and they would ask people like me, a college student who had no idea how to cook a meal for 50 people on the wood stove. So you'd end up with very unappetizing meals every day. And then with a belly full of indigestion, you'd be asked to work building in the dark and cold and damp in England. And then you'd get back into the tea time, which was whoever had been assigned to do that day in the kitchen had provided for you. 2 pots of something or other, usually a caffeinated option and a non-caffeinated option, and it would be like coffee, cocoa, coffee mate, white sugar mixture, or chamomile tea. And you ended up getting all high on the coffee and the cocoa and the sugar, and you're thinking, what am I doing to myself? This isn't peaceful. But recognizing that the challenges, though they weren't the same challenges as in Ubon 15 years earlier, and they're not the same challenges that we might have in our different places of practice now, those challenges were challenges, and because they were going to help me train. They were going to help me see where is it that I suffer. And the story that has stayed with me from Lumpur Samedo at the time that he went to Wat Pah Pong, the first year that he arrived there, that he tells, after having had a very pleasant and conventionally successful year meditating alone in Nong Khai before he'd arrived there, he'd gotten into all kinds of blissful states because of the space and support provided for his meditation practice. He arrived at Wat Pah Pong, and there was all kinds of things to do. Not just meditate, but clean and sweep and get up at, well, my memory was 2:45 when I was at Wat Pah Pong, and for a 3:15 puja, and then after the puja on the hard cement floor where you had to remain still, you'd clean, and then you'd get together and go on alms round barefoot for kilometers, and you'd get back and you'd clean, and then you'd sweep, and then you'd eat, and then you'd clean, and then you'd go back to your kuti, and you'd put out your robes, and you'd clean, and you'd sweep, and then somebody would ask you to help you make a broom, and so then you'd do that, and then you'd come back, and somewhere along there you got maybe a little bit of a nap on all the sticky rice you'd eaten. Your afternoon was in danger of disappearing, and Ajahn Sumedho, I can imagine, having done a little bit of that myself, was really thinking, what am I doing here? My mind is not peaceful. It was last year. Why do we have to do so many things here? We're sweeping a forest. It's a forest. Anybody who's been to a monastery in the Thai forest tradition knows you do a lot of sleeping, and yet it is a forest. And one does think, why? But you get the point after a while. There's an ethos of care and respect and mindfulness, which is supported by doing that and having that routine. And so at this particular point, and you've probably heard the story before, Lumpur Sumedho was thinking, this is terrible. Why is it like this? Why do we have to do all this sweeping? I'm hot and dusty. And Lumpur Cha came up to him with a big smile and said, "Oh, Sumedho, Wat Pah Pong is a lot of suffering, isn't it?" And laughed and then turned around and walked away. And he said it at the right time, in the right way, for Ajahn Sumedho to get the point that eventually all of us have to get. And I got myself somehow during that first year when I arrived at Amaravati in the dark and the damp, was that the suffering, well, it seems like it's on the outside. It's in the, the chickpeas and onions that the angry Anagarika has not quite cooked well enough on the wood stove, or it's in the sweeping and the dust and the mosquitoes that we have to bear with, or it's in, the politics of the time, or it's in your kids not doing what you think they should do. It's in the world. It's outside us. That's generally always how we're programmed to think and assume that it's true. Really, in terms of dukkha, the suffering that we're encouraged to learn to see through and release ourselves through, that's happening inside. So where is the suffering? And Ajahn Sumedho was able to see, well, actually, here I am sweeping, and I'm hot and bothered and thinking this is not going to support my meditation, and actually it's quite a peaceful thing to do. Just back and forth with the broom, and the sounds of the forest are quite peaceful. There's actually the only thing that's not peaceful is my mind. I'm sitting here making this big problem out of nothing. So we are encouraged in the monastic life, and all of us in the Buddhist training, whether you're doing that as a lay person or as a monk or a nun, to really learn this fundamental lesson. And to me, that's one of the keys that Ajahn Chah was able to successfully communicate in simple ways with a big smile, poking, to see where do we suffer and not to believe our minds. Another of the stories that was important in communicating just how well Lumpur Cha was tuned into how we make ourselves suffer with the way we think was when Ajahn Sumedho said that he came back to Wat Pah Pong after a few years in England, having encouraged some of the English lay women who wanted to practice and become nuns to come to England to meet someone, American Meichi Kampa, I think was her name, who was very, very excellent and upright in the practice. And so he brought them there, and he arrived at Wat Pah Pong all ready to introduce them, and he found that Meichi Kampa had become an evangelical born-again Christian. And he thought this was absolutely terrible. How could it happen? She really got it. How could she become a Christian? And he talked to her, and it didn't, she just said, "I can see the devil in you arising," and she was gone. And so he came to Ajahn Chah and said, "Lumpur, this is terrible. How could she become a Christian?" And obviously he was upset about this. And Lumpur Cha apparently just said to him, "Well, maybe she's right." In other words, aren't you making yourself suffer, Sumedho, by thinking that she shouldn't be thinking this way, right? It's not right. It's not supposed to happen this way. So we got our work cut out for us, all of us. Monks, we put on a robe. It doesn't make us holy. It just gives us a chance to practice. And all of you, we put on something white and come here and put our hands in Anjali and say the right words. It doesn't make you holy, does it? But it helps. You have a chance then to see your mind. We have a mirror upon which that our minds, our reality, our experience is reflected, and then we can learn. And that's what I take away from the legacy of Lumpur Cha, because of course, just like the past doesn't exist, Lumpur Cha doesn't exist except in our minds, except the stories that we tell each other, the images that we have. Ajahn Chah will be fierce, will be full of metta, will be wise, will always be wise in most of our minds probably, because those of us who know about him have come through this wonderful teaching and living communal legacy that he's left. And that community aspect of coming and practicing together, both in the monastic life, especially the Sangha, the way that the Sangha in Luang Cha's monasteries continues, and that way of working together was a particular feature of his emphasis, which has been very successful in holding us all together and continuing to keep us going, as well as this kind of event here in Malaysia, to come together. One doesn't need to have a 100-year Ajahn Chah Remembrance Day ceremony. It's an excuse to get together and have a Dhamma session for a weekend and invite good teachers, Luang Por Liam, Luang Por Piek, Luang Por Jandi, Ajahn Pasano, Luang Por Viradam, Luang Por Tirdo, so many Luang Pors. One wonders, where did the Luang Pors end and the Tanajans begin? I don't even know the answer myself. I think it's fairly arbitrary, right? But we have a chance to come together. We do it in Thailand every year, January 16th. There's an excuse to come together and practice, celebrating the practice in the life of Luang Por Chah around the time of the anniversary of his passing away. We have these opportunities, say, in the Western monasteries. Every few years we come together for gatherings to discuss business, yes, just like how do we run things, but also, and mostly, in my mind, as a gathering, coming together as the Buddha encouraged, in harmony, meeting in harmony, and dispersing in harmony. It keeps us together as a community of people who will be, yes, able to practice as individuals, even without a tradition, without a set of conventions, without a community. And yet, actually, practically, for almost every one of us, that won't be the case. We'll get lost. So we have the conventions. They're not ultimate truths. They're tools to use. And yet we lift them up, we respect them, we hold them together because they help us. They help us learn, and it brings possibility for blessings to arise in our own life and in the world. So I will leave it there this evening.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.